some of the vocabulary stuff that is around, Ashley and I have gone through it. So the Anthropocene, we're living in the Anthropocene, these the ecological breakdowns, mass extinctions. So that's kind of the realism of the doomer. But then all of a sudden, we talked about Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth and then Cosmopolitan Localism. Well, those seem like a decent, at least, through point into the optimism, at least more so than focusing only on the doom. So is there other vocabulary, other things that kind of are in your mind when you think doom or optimism? Like, what are some words? Because for me, when I think about it, solar punk is like such a big thing for me, because it's like, okay, that's like a very high-tech layer on a very embodied and bottom-up culture. So is that like what we strive for? Is there other things? Like,
I think solar punk, I like the aesthetic. I think that's kind of like best case scenario.
Right. Okay,
so in my more optimistic days, I'm thinking, okay, maybe something like a solar punk future is in the cards, Right. But, in my more pessimistic days, I'm thinking more like, kind of village economies of the past, right? More rural, kind of a de-urbanized, everybody's, more people are involved with growing food, more people are involved with their kind of, provisioning their basic needs. And perhaps it'll be something in between, right? Again, I think I'm a little bit more hesitant than some other doomer optimists to throw technology options out completely, but this idea of a high-tech layer on top, we haven't really learned, we don't really have, modern technologies that don't have some serious downsides, right? In terms of, extraction, rare earth minerals, we're going to get those, all of the energy that goes into
exploitation,
extracting the basic ore, smelting, creating these giant machines, transportation. So like, having this global system that can still trade, again, if you want solar panels, I'd like to get solar panels at some point, but I also recognize that all the parts for that come from all over the world. It requires global supply chains, right? And global supply chains are fragile. And so so it's kind of like I try and keep both things in my mind, right? Of like, that would be nice if we could figure out how to minimize the negative externalities or externalizing the costs, but at the same time, I don't want to put all my cards in that basket, right? Like what would I do if all of a sudden we ran out of electricity, we ran out of energy, right? And so going back to like reading, near-term dystopian fiction, like I recently read a series by Kunstler, John Howard Kunstler, A World Made by Hand, which is exactly this kind of scenario where like all of a sudden, basically electricity just runs out, and like nobody has, is connected to a grid anymore, basically. And so like, what would that look like? And
that might even look like if we have a solar flare. You know what I mean? Like that's a real thing that might could happen. All of a sudden, all information technology goes off overnight.
And so what would that look like? And I'm definitely not prepared for that scenario. Not even close.
Either. We're not.
Exactly. Nobody,
we're banking on.
Really, nobody is. Even homesteading. Most people on homesteading Twitter, like nobody's really ready for that, right? Like we all have dependencies.
Yes.
Like
that's a good
there's
point.
maybe like 2 homesteaders in the world that have like 0 dependencies, right? And we haven't heard about them.
Is that just being honest about the dependencies then? Is that really what it is about? Like, because then it's like you get all these, when you're not honest about it, then you have these preconceived notions or these ideologies, and then it's like, well, none of this is really real. Like,
I do think that there is that could be a tendency in homesteading Twitter to kind of like, and Ashley's talked about this, of like just presenting kind of like the cottage core, like the nice aesthetics and stuff like that, but like kind of pushing under the rug that like, hey, we're still connected to an energy grid, all of our tools, everything is sourced, from parts all over the world. Where do you get your shovel, right? Are you getting it from your local neighborhood?
Did you cast this alone?
Exactly. Or did you get it from, does my neighbor build, wheelbarrows and shovels? And no, they don't, right? Like I go to Lowe's or, the local version of Lowe's, right? But they, that source is from all over the world. So it's just, I think a little bit more realism in terms of like taking a little bit of the fantasy element out of the homesteading aesthetic. As Ashley says, like show the kind of the grit, grimy, and the fact that we've just, okay, we're growing like maybe 10% more of our own food, but that's not going to save you if everything falls apart overnight. Right. And so for me, it's like if we're lucky and if we are headed towards kind of a collapse of our current systems, it would happen, over decades where we have time to adapt, right? And we have time to make the transition to something different with the minimal damage possible. That would be, to me, that would be the ideal collapse scenario.
I see.
Is, multi-decade. But the thing I worry about is the harder life gets for people, the more, like, for example, scapegoats, they're going to, irrelevant scapegoats of like, it's really, this group of people that's causing my suffering. And so, I can also see the rise of not all of us kind of banding together and figuring out, a new system state, versus just all out war.
Right.
That's a real worry.
That's almost like that's almost what we're banking that almost will happen, but then we're hoping that it won't. Like, because that's really true. That's a good point.
And so the more that each of us can, try to empathize with different groups of people and try to see many different perspectives and get to know our neighbors. The more all of us do that, the better off we'll be in that kind of like the more trust that can be built now with different groups, the better. But sometimes I get online on Twitter and I get very pessimistic. Right?
Sure,
it's just like I see a lot of this us versus them dynamics. A lot of which seems to be misdirected.
Right.
To the deeper structural problems.